Ladies and gentlemen, it is so common to see conflict in the world, occurs almost every moment and everywhere. How to resolve conflict and promote cooperation has become a major topic in international politics. However, before we seek solutions, it is necessary to clarify how we understand conflict. I would like to discuss today two approaches, mainly in terms of understanding conflict. One is provided by the mainstream international relations discourse, and the other very much by the traditional Chinese dialectics. When I saw this sign, I asked Mr. Cook what it means. It says it looks like a yin-yang diagram. That embodies the Chinese dialectics, I will discuss in a moment. I think a comparative analysis will contribute to what this conference places emphasis on, that is intercultural dialogue for conflict resolution. First, I would like to discuss this conflict as normal approach. It is important to notice that we do have an understanding of international conflict in particular and conflict in general is ontologically significant, has a very special ontological status. When we read mainstream international relation theories, for example, realism, liberal institutionalism, and radical theories, tend to understand conflict as normal. It is normal in human life, in social settings, and in international relations. The important assumption is rooted in the Kantian-Hegelian framing of the self-other relationship, which argues that the self always needs a hostile other to construct her identity. The Hegelian dialectics helps further develop this fundamental assumption and holds that the interaction of the opposite poles, that is, thesis and antithesis, constitutes the dynamics of life. We see social progress in the conflictual interaction of the contradictory forces in the thesis versus antithesis competition. In international relations, conflict is more conspicuous and serious due to the deep-rooted understanding of international society as an anarchic, Hobbesian jungle, where almost everyone fights against everyone else because of the absence of Leviathan. Mainstream IR theories, for example, argues that conflict is the state of nature of international life. Struggle for power has always been the central theme of international relations. For the more liberal-oriented scholars, they believe conflict exists also as something normal, although they are all more optimistic about solutions through international institutions. And new leftist scholars even more believe in conflict between different socioeconomic classes and try to identify the key contradiction in world political economy. These interpretations of international life share a common tradition concerning the nature of conflict in human and social life. That is, conflict is normal, for it constitutes the state of nature. The second important assumption of this approach is that conflict comes from difference. Once two actors, whether they are individuals, groups, or nation states, are different, they tend to conflict with each other. In other words, difference causes conflict. The logic of reasoning is reflected in many important international thoughts. Think about two important theories, one at the beginning of the Cold War and the other at the end of it. Everyone studying international relations knows well of the long telegram by George Kennan, which argues that a conflictual relationship would be formed after the end of the Second World War between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two countries that had risen as the superpowers out of the war. After detailed analysis of the Soviet Union, Kennan concluded that it was the ideological difference between the two major players that would eventually lead to the inevitable conflict between the two giants. At the end of the Cold War, when the world witnessed a collapse of the conflictual bipolarity, the argument of clash of civilizations was put forward. Divided the world into several major civilizations and discussed the differences among them. It holds that the different civilizations tend to conflict with each other, and the world of different political ideologies which had characterized the Cold War years would be replaced by a world of different civilizations or civilization states, both leading inevitably to conflict. With the same line of thinking, Huntington's theory supports the argument that difference leads to conflict. By this reasoning, we have the third assumption that conflict resolution is fundamentally based on the elimination of difference. The other, which the self needs for her identity formation, differs from the self and thus constitutes the source of conflict. By eliminating the other, the potential for conflict between the self and other is removed, though perhaps temporarily. Quite often the strategies resort to force. By eliminating the enemy, we solve the conflict. The importance of a hard material power has been stressed, for it is considered the most effective means to elimination of the hostile other. To solve a potential serious conflict, for example, we may compare whose nuclear button is bigger. Soft power, however, is equally or even more effective for the same purpose because it is to co-opt the other, making the other become the same as the self. Once the other wants to do what you want them to do, she is no longer different, and the possibility for conflict largely disappears. It is similar about identity politics, which argues that different identities cause conflict. Islamic and Christian people differ, and they tend to have conflict. Christian and Confucian peoples differ, and therefore they also tend to have conflict. Most of the security community literature sets a precondition for the establishment of such a community. They must have shared and similar values. Otherwise, it is impossible for such a community to exist. Now let me turn to the second approach, which I call the conflict as abnormal approach. The traditional Chinese understanding of conflict differs. For both Taoism and Confucianism alike, the state of nature is harmony. Both harmony between humans and nature, and perhaps especially among humans. The Chinese dialectics, for example, also sees the world in polar terms, and the interaction of the polar forces are the prime mover for progress. But unlike the Hegelian dialectics, it sees the polar forces as a complementary interaction and inclusive harmony. They complement, empower, and give life to each other. In other words, they are not thesis and antithesis. They are co-thesis, depending on each other for life. Thus, conflict is abnormal. It goes with the worldview that the self-other relationship is harmonious in the very beginning. Harmony, therefore, is the state of nature. Such an understanding, as well as the worldview behind it, constitutes a contrast with the theory that conflict is normal. First, it denies conflict the ontological significance. Since harmony is the state of nature and enjoys the significant ontological status, conflict is no longer normal. Rather, it is abnormal. It is true that we see conflict everywhere and almost every moment, but it does not mean that it's natural. Conflict is understood as deviation from the normal. The Chinese dialectics interprets the self-other relationship in terms of the yin-yang relationship. As I mentioned just now, yin and yang are the two opposite forces and somewhat similar to the Hegelian thesis and antithesis, but they differ. The key difference between the Chinese tradition from the Hegelian model is about relationship and the nature of relationship between the opposites. For the latter, it is conflictual in nature, while for the former, it is essentially harmonious. Any two opposite terms are, by definition, complementary and inclusive of each other. Together, they create life and generate dynamics for progress. There is conflict of interests, of desire, of preferences, of values. Such conflict does not enjoy the same status as harmony. Only when people deviate from the right way, conflict emerges. Since any opposite forces are potentially complementary, common grounds are always possibly and potentially there. Therefore, conflict is fundamentally resolvable. Second, it denies the argument that conflict is caused by difference. Not only does it not deny this argument, but also it takes difference as the foundation and the necessary condition for harmony, just as different notes make beautiful music and different gradients make delicious food. In other words, it sees beauty in difference, in heterogeneity, and in plurality. Yin and yang are always different, for example, representing the male and the female forces. But exactly because they differ, they make life together. Similarly, the world is meaningful because it is plural with different cultures, civilizations, and lifestyles. Fundamentally, they should not be taken as sources of conflict. From this logic, conflict resolution is not about elimination of difference. Rather, it is to seek ways for different elements to work cooperatively together. How to make them work together is the fundamental principle for conflict resolution, which relies on three related measures. The first is to seek common grounds. This logic never believes that there's no common ground for any two opposite forces. Such forces are inclusive of and complementary to each other in the beginning, and therefore there must be shared interests between them. Any two social beings tend to share something. If we see no common ground at all, it is simply we have not yet found them. Thus, to solve conflict, the first step is usually to carefully and accurately find where the common ground is. Even for deadly enemies like the United States and Soviet Union, they shared a common ground for self-survival in the nuclear era, so they cooperated. The second is to encourage complementary differences. Means that solutions to conflict depend on difference rather than on elimination of difference. It is exactly because of difference that mutual complementarity is possible. In terms of regional integration, for example, there are the European model and the ASEAN way. They differ. However, they should not be seen as rival models or as alternatives to each other. In fact, there are a lot they can complement each other through learning those differences that can make up for their own weaknesses. The high degree of flexibility of ASEAN may reduce the rigidity of the European Union, while the adherence to rule-based institutionalism of the latter may make ASEAN more effective. Third, mediation provides a most sustainable way to conflict resolution. I quite agree with the Foreign Minister, Deputy Prime Minister. Mediation is so important. Elimination of difference should not be the main choice for conflict resolution simply because it is impossible. Difference exists. Doesn't matter you like it or not. It is normal and natural. Nobody can eliminate difference. Elimination through assimilation by soft power is also impossible. In our world, nobody can change the other into something like the self. Practical conflict resolution requires both the conflicting parties to move towards the appropriate middle, which is usually their shared ground. Mediation encourages them to take such moves and therefore constitutes a useful way to conflict resolution. This is a belief in that there are always common grounds to be found, that skillful orchestration of difference can make it become positive and complementary elements for cooperation, and that mediation is often more sustainable than elimination as solutions to conflict. Of course, these are two ideal types, two ideal approaches. The reality is much more complex, but it is realistic to think about different approaches in the world based upon different perspectives from different civilizations and cultures. In this respect, I think this conference is highly valuable, meaningful, and inspiring. I thank you for your attention.